Hello, everyone. Tonight we're diving into a darker atmosphere, an era of scorching heat, harsh punishments, and parched canals. We'll explore what life was truly like in ancient Babylon. Forget the lavish hanging gardens and the majestic Tower of Babel portrayed by Hollywood. The reality is you probably wouldn't last a single day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy what you're watching here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see viewers tuning in from all around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some ambient background noise, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1750 BCE. The good news is, you're alive. The bad news is, so are the flies. Your bed is a coarse woven mat laid on cracked clay ground, filled with dust, insects, and musty-smelling hay. Because 3 months ago, it was indeed a shelter for goats. No memory foam, no soft pillows, and certainly no Egyptian linen sheets. Just an old, tattered hemp cloth, as heavy as a sheep due to accumulated grime. You blink awake as the harsh Babylonian sun beams directly through the gap in the roof. It's the Babylonian version of an alarm clock, just hotter and much more ruthless. Your home is a one-room mud brick hut, windowless, with a rather charming open design, where your entire family, small pets, and flies coexist under one roof. The aroma? Oh, it's a full symphony of scents. A gentle blend of dust, human sweat, mildew, and something you can only hope isn't waste, but deep down, you know it is. Fragrances weren't common, and even if they were, the 45 to 50 degrees Celsius heat would have evaporated them all. You try to stretch, but immediately regret it as the air is stiflingly hot and your joints are sticky. You're 22 years old, which means middle-aged by Babylonian standards. Your spine creaks like a rotting wooden door, and your knees crunch like a bag of rolling sand. Getting out of bed is a gamble. The floor might be damp from water seeping through the mud walls last night, or hard and dry because the neighbor's cat left a gift. Either way, your bare feet are now part of the ecosystem. And privacy? What's that? Your entire family, even an unnamed uncle who never leaves, is waking up right beside you. No bedrooms, no curtains, no personal space. Just complete communal living. Good morning in ancient Babylon, where you're never truly alone because parasites, rats, and 8 other people are always around. And that's just how the day begins. It only gets worse from here. You've managed to crawl out of the horrifying Babylonian straw nest. Congratulations. Now, nature calls, but not politely, it screams in your face. And this is when you start missing your modern bathroom. No toilet, no lid, no toilet paper, no flushing, and not even that annoying plunger in the corner. In the 18th century BCE, relieving yourself was an adventure, a social experiment, and often a small community event. Your toilet might be a corner of the backyard, already filled because the mole yesterday ate a rotten onion. The smell is truly biblical. You hold your breath, finish your business, and here's the shock. You dump it onto the street. Yes, onto the street. In theory, you're supposed to shout, "Beware!" Ancient English for "watch out," before tossing it out the door. But honestly, no one dodges in time. Babylonian streets were open sewers, a river of human waste, animal dung, and mysterious liquids you don't want to identify. If you're lucky enough to live in an area with a simple drainage system, congratulations. You get to sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers in a latrine where privacy is a myth and ventilation is a cruel joke. You might chat a bit, but remember not to take deep breaths. Toilet paper doesn't exist. Most people wiped with leaves, dry grass, or if they were fancy, a scrap of cloth. Sometimes they didn't wipe at all. Perhaps that's why handshakes weren't common back then. And if you lived in a castle, things must be better, right? Well, somewhat. You might have a waste pit or a system that led waste to the river. A good idea until flies and stench still lingered. And yes, there were cases where enemies exploited that system to infiltrate. Literally, breaking in through the back door. So whether you're a farmer or a lord, answering nature's call in Babylon was a humiliating ritual. Hot, public, dangerous, and never clean. One slip on the muddy brick-paved roads of Babylon and you'd faceplant into humanity's waste. And you haven't even brushed your teeth yet, but we'll discuss that later. You've survived the foul public toilet. You deserve a reward, right? Perhaps a delicious breakfast. Something warm, tasty, comforting. Sorry, this is ancient Babylon. Nothing is comforting here. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is a bleak affair.
No ex Benedict.
No chirping coffee machine to wake you up, and certainly no buttered toast. You squat near the fire with a piece of hard barley bread, an onion, and a sip of weak beer. Welcome to your daily ration. Barley bread is the main dish, so hard it could deflect arrows. It's made from coarse barley flour, often bulked up with whatever else could be found, because wheat is the dream of the wealthy. This loaf is not your friend. You don't slice it, you negotiate with it. And the drinks? You're not sipping orange juice or oat milk lattes. You're drinking beer. Yes, beer. At 6 a.m. Why? Because drinking water is a luxury and a hazard, especially in the hot season. Finding clean water is a real challenge. So you start your day with weak beer, low in alcohol, high in survival. Children drink it too. Nobody's happy about that, but at least it won't kill you instantly. No end-of-day bell. Just dawn to dusk, 6 days a week. The 7th might be for worship, but only if you're not plowing, defending against river raiders on the Euphrates, or fervently praying for your infected toe to stop turning black. The work is brutal. Fields are plowed by hand or by wooden plows pulled by oxen, if you're rich enough to own any. You dig irrigation canals, sow seeds, pull weeds, and haul water from the river until your spine starts resembling the letter S. No one cares if you're tired. No one asks about your mental health. If you're a woman, surprise, you don't just work the fields. You also take care of the children. You clean the clay house, cook over open flames, spin wool, bake bread, feed livestock, and pretend your husband's lice aren't slowly invading your side of the bed. Children start helping out by around 5 years old. No school, no toys, just a little clay trowel and a dream of not dying from disease or snakebite one day. And if you're one of the few who isn't a farmer, maybe you're a potter, a weaver, or a brickmaker, wonderful. You still work with clay, water, and fire all day in poorly ventilated sheds. Wages. Basically enough to survive on simple meals. Perks. Occasional nosebleeds from the smoke and dust. Broken bone? Sorry, you might become a burden to your family. Fever? Drink some warm barley beer and keep going. You can't stop, not even for one day. Because if you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, well, Babylon has a solution for that. It's called being replaced. Moreover, slavery is common. You could be enslaved for unpaid debts or captured in war. The life of a slave is endless servitude, constant beatings, and unrelenting fear. They're forced to labor on massive fortresses or do grueling work in quarries until they collapse. No hope, no freedom. So you grip your shovel, ignore the blisters, and keep digging. Because in Babylon, your job isn't a career. It's a slow-motion endurance test. Now that your back is burning from fieldwork or hauling stones, let's talk about the weather. Because in Babylon, the temperature has less to do with seasons and more with continuous punishment from the sky, scorching everything into dust. Let's start with summer. No insulation, no cooling systems, no weather protection. Just clay walls that trap heat like a giant kiln. The air is so dry it cracks your lips and your skin. Plants barely survive without irrigation. You sweat through every layer of clothing, but can't remove them. Exposing too much skin is shameful and leads to sunburn, heat stroke, and dehydration. No sunscreen, no proper hats, unless you make one out of straw like a desperate scarecrow. Yes, the sun scorches you without mercy. Dust storms choke the air, especially inside clay homes that feel like glowing embers. You wrap yourself in your only garment, try to find a sliver of shade, and still wake up with a throat like sandpaper. Your feet are always burning, often cracked. Your fingers stiff from dehydration. Heat exhaustion isn't diagnosed. It's simply called bad luck. Now, onto the rainy season. Sounds like a relief, right? Wrong. During the rains, your house turns into a mud pile. No fans, no breezes, and absolutely no deodorant. Flooding is common. Clothes stick to your body with no change because there are no dry clothes. Flies gather in crowds, drawn to your unwashed body, and the smell of last week's lamb stew fermenting in the corner. Mosquitoes buzz by your ears as you try to sleep, assuming you can sleep through the dripping water and crying children. Your feet are always cold, constantly damp, and sometimes blistered from being soaked too long. And the worst part is you still have to work. Heat stroke or illness is just called falling sick. So you're either holding your breath in your hut, wondering when the flood will come, or sweating in your only pair of socks while your thighs chafe to the point of agony. And the one thing that never changes, no matter the season, is that the clothes are still itchy, the food is still awful, and the next task is still waiting. Welcome to Babylonian air conditioning, which is exactly nothing. Thirsty? Want to feel alert? Want to splash some water on your face to wake from this moist/dry nightmare? No chance. In Babylon, water is not your friend. It's silently killing you. Let's start with drinking it. The nearby Euphrates River may look majestic, a lifeline like in some ancient relief. But spoiler, it's not. Upstream, someone just dumped some manure. And if not that, then probably a decomposing livestock carcass is bobbing in it. Parasites, bacteria, and an entire Mesopotamian microbiological army await in every sip. That's why people drank beer. Yes, beer, even children. But before you imagine Babylonian kids doing keg stands, understand that it was weak beer, low in alcohol, high in survival. Brewing it meant boiling the water, so it was safer than whatever was trickling through the canals. Wine was another option, if you were rich enough to afford it and didn't care about being sober before noon. And bathing? Surely water was used for cleanliness, right? Theoretically, yes. But in reality, absolutely not. You see, ancient people believed bathing opened your pores and let illness invade your body. That's right. Bathing was considered a health hazard. You were thought to be cleaner if you never removed the protective layer of dirt on your skin. Public bathhouses may have existed, but they quickly became known for gossip, scandal, and sometimes extracurricular Babylonian activities. Even if you wanted to bathe, it was an ordeal. You had to haul water from a distant river or canal, boil it over a fire, pour it into a cracked clay tub, and pray no one in your household used it before you, or worse, after you. Rainwater was collected in open barrels where birds pooped, insects bred, and moss thrived. Refreshing, isn't it? So whether it's water that goes into your mouth, onto your body, or into the fields, Babylonian water isn't a life source. It's a gamble. One wrong sip and you're ending your days on a straw mat, sweating, clutching your stomach, and contemplating your entire life. Next time you drink tap water, raise a glass to our ancestors. They didn't have the luxury of drinking water without danger, so go ahead and drink. Or maybe don't. Maybe you just stubbed your toe on a rock shaped like disappointment. Either way, you're sick. You need help. You need a doctor. Too bad you live in ancient Babylon, where medicine is basically polite reassurance wrapped in charms and incense smoke. Let's start with diagnostics, shall we? Everything that goes wrong in your body, from a cough, rash, and broken bone to a plague, is believed to be the work of evil spirits or the wrath of the gods. According to Babylonian science, your health depends on how well you've pleased the gods and banished demons, as if you were some kind of living sacrifice. Got a fever? Clearly a demon is burning you up. The cure? Incantations and bloodletting. That's right. Drain your life force into a bowl using a flint blade or a hungry leech, while a priest mutters spells under his breath. And yes, fortune tellers often doubled as your healthcare providers. Imagine getting your horoscope read and your blood drained all in one sitting. 2 for 1. Feeling sad or anxious? Obviously, you're possessed by malevolent spirits. The cure? Steam baths using dry dung. Maybe a purification ritual, or just prayers and cold compresses, while everyone avoids eye contact and starts carving clay for your coffin. If you break a bone or have a major injury, you're in serious trouble. No anesthesia unless you pass out from the pain. Surgery is done with flint knives that haven't been sterilized since the days of Sargon the Great. Tools are fire-hardened, not for cleanliness, but to make them look more intimidating. Antibiotics are a few millennia away. Germ theory hasn't been invented. People believe disease is divine punishment or the result of your moral failings. Stomach ache? Must be your sinful thoughts. Hope you enjoy vomiting while confessing to your gods. If your condition worsens, you'll be treated with more bloodletting, maybe some powdered ashes, and a priest sitting by your bedside chanting a final spell, just in case. By this point, everyone's emotionally ready for the ultimate cure, death. And if by some miracle you survive, people will say the gods showed mercy. The priest takes all the credit, and the leech gets promoted. That's right, in Babylon, medicine isn't about healing. It's about surviving after you've been appeased. After a long day of labor, lice, and leeches, it's finally mealtime. You drag yourself back to the hut, stomach growling, ready for the only joy left in life, a hot meal. Bad news, that meal is probably plotting to kill you. Let's start with the basics. Food preservation is virtually non-existent. No fridge, no freezer, just salt, sun-drying, or hope that the dry air keeps it edible. Meat, if you're lucky enough to have any, has been hanging for days, swarmed by flies, soaked in suspicious brine, and possibly shared with a few rats. Barley is the foundation of the Babylonian diet. But even barley isn't safe. Crop failure, floods, and droughts mean total loss and citywide famine. And if it's the hot season, when it gets scorching, there's a bonus treat. Toxic mold growing on bread, causing seizures, hallucinations, and sometimes death. Eating bread back then was like chewing on poisoned mushrooms mixed with tetanus. Vegetables were scarce, only available in the right season. And you know what's always available year-round? Barley. Lots of barley. Boiled, mashed, or floating in a stew. Which, if you recall from the previous chapter, is that bubbling swamp of mysterious ingredients that's probably been simmering since your great-grandfather died. Fruit might appear in the autumn, but it spoils quickly. Sugar is rare, expensive, and hoarded by the wealthy to flaunt their blackened teeth. Dairy is a gamble. Fresh milk goes bad within hours. Butter and cheese last longer, but are teeming with bacteria. But people still eat them because it beats chewing on your own shoe leather. And speaking of spices, pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, pricier than gold. For commoners, flavor comes from onions, salt if you're lucky, and suffering. Most meals taste like wet burlap sprinkled with sorrow. But food isn't just a health hazard, it's political. Wild animals and land belong to kings or temples, not to you. Get caught stealing a pigeon, and you could be punished under the Code of Hammurabi, imprisoned, or even executed. That's right, your dinner could get you hanged. So when you sit before a pale gray stew under flickering firelight, remember that every bite is a gamble. But you still eat. Because in Babylon, food isn't to nourish, it's to test you. Night has fallen. You've worked, endured, and just managed to swallow the questionable stew. Think your day is over? Don't exhale yet, the gods are watching. So is the priest. And so is your neighbor Circera, ready to snitch if you skip a ritual. In ancient Babylon, religion wasn't just part of life. It was all of life. The gods controlled your calendar, your laws, your education. If you could read your birth, marriage, death, and everything in between. Imagine the temple as your supreme master, and you owe it devotion and obedience. Every day is scheduled around prophecies. Gongs ring in the morning, noon, and night, not because anyone needs reminders, but because deviating from ritual is taboo. Forget to bow before Marduk, sin. Eat meat the wrong way, sin. Dream about your neighbor's wife, double sin. And yes, hell is real, very real. Priests described it in vivid, glorious detail. Cursed barren lands, wandering souls thirsting for water, and eternal wailing under the rule of Ereshkigal. If the plague doesn't scare you, eternal damnation certainly will. You couldn't interpret omens on your own because they were written in complex cuneiform, a language reserved for priests, scribes, and aristocrats who never lifted a hand in the fields. You had to rely on the temple to explain everything, which meant that if the priest said your crops failed because you weren't devout enough, then kneel lower. Offerings to the gods. meaning a tenth of your possessions were mandatory. Grow grain? Hand over grain. Raise goats? Hand over meat. Got nothing? Congratulations. You're now spiritually bankrupt and economically doomed. Holy days, meaning sacred days, were plentiful, and while they gave you a break from labor, they weren't for fun. They were for sacrifice, prayer, repentance, and reminding yourself that joy is a dangerous indulgence. Questioning the gods was a dangerous act. Blasphemers got beaten, skeptics got purified swiftly. An eclipse or a meteor shower was seen as a bad omen, enough to shut down an entire city. So you comply, you chant, you bow, you pray that after your soul endures this mud-caked life, it might find peace under the protection of Marduk, if the priest likes you, because in Babylon the gods might be merciful, but the priesthood is not. If you think being a Babylonian farmer is bad, try doing it as a woman. All the filth, hunger, and fear, plus childbirth, submission, and invisibility in society. Being a woman in Babylon was like playing life on extreme difficulty. No health potions, no restart button. From birth, a girl's path was mostly set. Marry young, bear children, serve your husband, and die exhausted. Education, forget it. Unless you were born into nobility and sent to a temple to train as a priestess, your intellectual development stopped at grinding grain and weaving cloth. Marriage happened early, very early. Being engaged at 12 and pregnant by 14 wasn't unusual. It wasn't about love. It was about land, livestock, and alliances. Your opinion wasn't required. Once married, you were nearly your husband's property. Your duties: produce heirs, feed the household, manage the kitchen, and don't complain. Because if you did, you might be labeled disruptive, or worse, disobedient to the gods. That label came with a combo deal: being tossed into the river for the gods to decide your fate. Childbirth was a life or death lottery. No prenatal care, no sterile tools, no anesthesia. Midwives did their best, but even a minor complication could mean death for the mother, the baby, or both. Some women had 10 children. Many didn't survive the first. But don't worry, once the baby's out, your real work begins. Now you have a crying child in a lice-infested hut, and you're still expected to breastfeed, cook, clean, and work the fields. You don't get to rest. You are other people's rest. If you're unmarried, you're suspicious. A widow, you're vulnerable. Strong, you're dangerous. Women who didn't fit the mold were often accused of lacking divine favor, especially if they knew about herbs, had strong personalities, or simply looked at someone funny on a drizzly Tuesday. Even in temples, your role was limited. Priestesses lived by strict rules. Don't speak without permission, don't move freely, and your spiritual worth always ranked below that of men. In short, if you were a woman in Babylon, you were expected to endure, obey, reproduce, and suffer silently, preferably with a smile on your face. You were family, but never the head of the household, because even in a time where everyone suffered, women were expected to suffer gracefully. By now, you've fought filth, famine, social injustice, and possibly a goat. But just when you think your day couldn't get any worse, violence arrives. Loud, bloody, and often fully sanctioned by Babylonian standards. Let's be clear, Babylon was not a peaceful society. The concept of law and order mostly meant that an eye for an eye would be enforced without mercy. Violence was everywhere, in homes, on streets, on battlefields, in temple disputes, and sometimes even in line at the public water well. Crime was common, punishment was brutal, and justice looked more like performance art than protection. Steal a loaf of bread? You might lose a hand. Accused of lying? Your tongue could be cut out. Gossip too much? Get ready for a public beating, a painful correction. Of course, suppose you're accused of something serious: heresy, theft, or disobedience to your father. How do you prove your innocence? By accepting punishment, obviously. Welcome to the Code of Hammurabi. One version: if a son's father beats someone, the son loses his hand instead. Another version: if you're poor, you have no right to a defense because the law didn't protect people. It ruled through fear and maintained order with violence. It was like a Babylonian game show where the prize was survival, and the host was rooting for your death. And if you were sentenced to execution, it became a public event. Executions were carried out in front of cheering crowds. Hanging, beheading, burning alive. Sometimes people even brought snacks. It was ancient cable television. Domestic violence was completely normal. Husbands were allowed, sometimes even encouraged, to beat their wives and children. Street fights were everyday occurrences. You could get assaulted just for looking the wrong way at a nobleman's cow. And war was always simmering. Local feuds, territorial disputes, expeditions in the name of Marduk. There was always someone marching off to stab someone else for honor, gods, or just boredom. Violence wasn't the collapse of Babylonian society. It was society. Everyone lived with the understanding that life was fragile, justice was fickle, and your neighbor could smash your head in over a pig. So walk carefully, keep your head down, and never trust the man with the stick. By this point, you've survived lice, leeches, laundryless life, and the looming threat of public disembowelment. But now comes the final chapter of Most Lives in Babylon, an early and inglorious death. If you were still alive and breathing past age 40, you were basically a celebrity. People might call you old man or old woman, not as a nickname, but as a statistical miracle. Let's break it down. The average lifespan was very short, and that number was dragged down heavily by infant mortality. Nearly half of all children died before the age of 5. Disease, malnutrition, or just a harsh winter was enough. No medicine, no antibiotics, no hope. If you survived childhood, you entered adulthood with a body already worn out. Work began as soon as you could walk upright, and by 25, your joints creaked like a watermill. You might have lost a few teeth, a finger, and most of your early optimism. Women faced a special death game, childbirth. It was one of the leading causes of death for Babylonian women. No painkillers, no medical intervention, just prayers, hot water, and someone to hold your hand as you bled out on a straw mat. For men, the dangers were different but equally brutal. Agricultural accidents, infections from minor wounds, the wrath of a drunken neighbor, or a military campaign gone wrong. Even going to the market could be deadly if you crossed paths with a bored bandit or an irritable tax collector. Death could also arrive quietly, from a plague that turned a city into a graveyard overnight, or from famine that dragged on for a season, collapsing entire villages, or just plain bad luck, like eating spoiled grain and spending your final hours hallucinating and screaming at the walls. As for funerals, if you got one, consider yourself lucky. Bodies were often buried quickly to prevent disease. No embalming, no polished coffins. Just a hole, a few whispered prayers, and a shallow mound of dirt. That is, if there was even space left in the city cemetery. Yes, in Babylon, life was brutal, short, and constantly surrounded by death in all its indifferent forms. There was no such thing as retirement, you just stopped showing up. And speaking of departures, let's move on to your final chapter. The Babylonian dream fades. So how was your day? You woke up in filth, relieved yourself into a bucket, brushed your teeth with hope, nearly fainted from hunger, worked until your spine begged for mercy, scratched through layers of itchy wool, prayed not to catch a plague, and almost got publicly executed for keeping a pet squirrel. Welcome to a typical day in Babylon. Still dreaming of becoming a wise priest or a mighty warrior? Think again. The romanticized version of Babylon. The master architects. The mystical priestesses on towering ziggurats. The glorious battles and glittering banquets in gold-draped halls are myths, polished by epics and legend. The reality, Babylon was dusty, ruthless, and profoundly unjust. Class was everything. Born a slave? You die a slave. Born a noble? Congrats, you have a slightly higher survival rate. But you could still die from bad stew and get buried in a hurry. Even nobles weren't spared from misery. Palaces were cold brick fortresses filled with lice, kitchen smoke, and political marriages. Sure, you had a silk robe and a date wine goblet, but there was still a 50% chance of dying in a brawl or from an infected pottery shard. Not glamorous at all. The simple old days were, in fact, anything but simple. Everything took longer. Everything hurt more. From childbirth to chewing your food, everything came with a cost. Life was about surviving, not enjoying. And if you were lucky enough to have a quiet moment to think, dream, or imagine something better, you couldn't do much about it. No upward mobility, no modern medicine, no clay tablet to search, what is this rash? You lived, endured, worked, and died within 10 miles of where you were born. But the most surprising part? Through all of it, people still laughed, still sang, told stories, fell in love, and searched for meaning. Not because life was easy, but because people are stubborn like that. Even in the darkest chapters, they carved out sparks of light. So tonight, as you lie in your clean bed with indoor plumbing, antibiotics, and central heating, take a moment to thank the modern world and your ancestors who fought off rats, famine, and the Code of Hammurabi so you wouldn't have to. Before she became Queen Semiramis, Empress of all Babylon, a symbol of power and ambition, she was just an abandoned little girl. Born as Shamaram, daughter of the fish goddess Atargatis and a mortal man, she was left behind and raised by a flock of doves. Was later found by a shepherd. The land where she grew up held little power. But Shamaram herself was different. She possessed what no title could bestow: sharp intelligence, enduring charm, and a smoldering, burning hunger for greatness. Her childhood was harsh. She grew up in the wild, learning to survive and observe the world with her own eyes. There were no cold or strict parents, but life quickly shaped her into someone fiercely independent with a will of iron. From a young age, Shamaram learned to seize opportunities and use her wits to overcome any obstacle. She was discovered by Anas, an advisor to the king of Assyria. Enchanted by her beauty and intellect, he brought her back as his wife. Her keen perception and adaptability soon became her survival tools within one of the harshest courts in Babylon. When Anas realized her exceptional abilities, he introduced her to King Ninus of Assyria. Ninus was quickly captivated by Shamaram. She left Anas and became the wife of Ninus. This was no ordinary marriage, it was the door to an empire. No one in the crowd that day, watching the humble-born girl, could have imagined what would follow. Betrayal, absolute power, grand conquests, and an empire at her feet. But from the moment Shamaram entered the Assyrian court, she stopped being a pawn and began planning to become queen. Her marriage to King Ninus was seen as a move to cement her place in the Assyrian royal family. But from the beginning, it felt more like a cage than a crown. Ninus, ruler of Assyria, was not the wise king of legend. Arrogant, coarse, and obsessed with conquest, he cared more about expanding territory than governing wisely or showing affection to his new wife. Some accounts even claim Ninus neglected Semiramis for years. He worshipped power and was constantly dissatisfied with the limits of his empire, the same empire that had placed him on the throne. In contrast, Semiramis embraced Assyria with fierce resolve. She learned the Akkadian language, studied Mesopotamian history, and memorized religious rituals. She wanted to belong here. Ninus only wanted to conquer. That divide wasn't just emotional, it was political. The Assyrian court was a viper's nest of rumors, paranoia, and ruthless power plays. King Ninus still reigned with absolute authority, but his health was failing. Everyone knew the moment of transition was near, and everyone had their own agenda. Semiramis was constantly watched. Her letters were intercepted, her friends monitored, and her every move scrutinized. She couldn't trust her husband, her family, who whispered in her ear for their own gain, or even her own servants. In this world, allies could become informants overnight. But Semiramis was not naive. She learned how to play the quiet game of the court, skillfully building relationships in the shadows. She charmed military generals, befriended scholars, and cultivated a reputation as calm and calculated, the complete opposite of her husband's childish rages and open disdain for local traditions. Behind closed doors, Semiramis began studying strategic maps and listening to whispers about the future. While others saw her only as a young wife, she was quietly building a vision, not just for herself, but for the entire Assyrian Empire, a nation of intellect, power, and prosperity. But there was one problem. The longer Ninus lived, the more trapped Semiramis became. a powerless wife to a man unfit to rule. So she waited, observed, and plotted. She knew the Assyrian throne would not be inherited. It had to be taken. Eventually, after years of waiting, watching, and carefully maneuvering, Semiramis saw her chance and seized it with astonishing precision. King Ninus died. Some legends suggest he was assassinated or overthrown by Semiramis herself. Semiramis, now queen regent, officially took power. The reign of Ninus collapsed almost instantly. After his death, Semiramis swiftly consolidated control. She crushed any signs of rebellion, won over the nobility, reinforced the military, and tirelessly promoted the glory of Assyria. She reversed key policies, enacted reforms, and openly demonstrated her wisdom and talent. The court, already wary of Ninus's erratic behavior, now looked to her with newfound respect. The military, full of generals loyal to Semiramis, murmured approval through palace corridors. Even the common Babylonian citizens, deeply religious and patriotic, saw her as a savior, a queen who would bring prosperity. Semiramis, observing it all, made her move. With the backing of key military commanders, she quickly solidified her authority, was proclaimed Queen Semiramis, and earned the loyalty of the entire army. Ninus, caught off guard and without allies, faded swiftly from the stage of history. Now Semiramis was queen, not by bloodline, not by marriage, but by will, intelligence, and boldness. Unprecedented. A foreign-born woman, with no direct claim to the throne, had taken the crown of Babylon without a single great battle. But the real challenge was only beginning. She had to turn that bold power shift into a lasting legacy. Would Babylon accept her? Would the nobility respect her? Could she maintain the empire without ending like those who came before? Semiramis knew that power won through strategy could be lost just as easily. She needed to rule not as a schemer, but as a reformer. And so began the journey from careful tactician to great queen, the woman who would redraw the map, build monumental structures like the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and redefined what it meant for a woman to wield absolute power. Once she had the crown, Semiramis could have rested on the throne. But she didn't, because she wanted something more, not just to sit on the throne. She wanted to transform Babylon, not just militarily or politically, but intellectually. While previous kings worshipped the power of conquest and colossal warriors, Semiramis admired great architects, brilliant astrologers, and bold thinkers of the age. She believed in reason, progress, knowledge, and the role of a monarch as a servant of the people, even as she ruled with absolute authority. Semiramis didn't just read philosophies about construction. She lived by them. She worked directly with top architects for many years, both elevating them and protecting her autocracy. She invited scientists to her court, even commissioned grand libraries to gather knowledge. Behind closed doors, she pored over maps, debated irrigation systems, and drafted policies to modernize the empire. Her early reign was filled with efforts to systematize Babylonian architecture. She laid the groundwork for massive projects, an ambitious vision to remake the entire face of the city. The directive of Semiramis was a manifesto on urban planning, speaking of architectural harmony, the dangers of resource waste, and the ruler's responsibility to serve the common good. For a queen in ancient Babylon, this was revolutionary. But Semiramis's ideals had to contend with the reality of Babylon, a vast, conservative land, ruled by a nobility who preferred the people to stay in their place, which meant underfoot. Semiramis knew this. While promoting construction, she acted cautiously. She abolished certain forms of harsh labor, expanded access to advanced building techniques, established schools of art and libraries. But she also reaffirmed the nobles' control over the commoners, to retain their loyalty. This was Semiramis's balancing act, a public queen of creation, a private queen of pragmatism. She walked a tightrope between idealism and survival, between grand blueprints and the tangled politics of Babylon. Her vision for Babylon was bold but always calculated. Semiramis didn't want to make Babylon resemble any other empire. She wanted to modernize it on her own terms, That meant building, yes, but with an iron hand in a velvet glove. Semiramis wasn't content to reform from within. She wanted to expand, to make Babylon an empire feared by enemies, respected by allies, and loyally served by its people. If previous kings opened doors to neighboring lands, Semiramis aimed to tear down the walls entirely. Under her leadership, Babylon's borders stretched further than ever before. She launched. War was not just about protecting the throne, it was about redrawing the map of the ancient world. One of her most significant campaigns was against hostile kingdoms in the east. These wars, spanning decades, were not merely territorial grabs, but battles for influence. Semiramis saw herself as a liberator of peoples living under oppressive rule, and as the rightful guardian of Mesopotamia. Under the command of brilliant generals, Babylon seized vital regions, took control of trade routes and fertile lands, things Babylonian kings had dreamed of for generations. These victories were not only military, they were symbolic. Each conquest was a declaration. Babylon was no longer the small neighbor of the world, it was a continental power. She also turned her gaze westward. Through clever diplomacy, Semiramis took part in dividing lands, carving up minor kingdoms alongside other great empires. Babylon gained millions of new subjects and vast territories. But Semiramis didn't conquer solely with armies. She colonized with ideas. New cities rose. Trade routes expanded. People from across lands were invited to settle and cultivate Babylon's soil. The empire became a colossal mosaic, from arid deserts to bountiful rivers. Through it all, Semiramis remained the center. She read reports, issued decrees, and personally oversaw the shape of her expanding empire. Critics called her power-hungry. Some even accused her of imperialism. But to Semiramis, expansion was not ambition, it was destiny. A great ruler, in her view, was judged not just by ideals, but by maps. She didn't want to merely rule Babylon. She wanted to reshape it into a civilized empire, one that made enemies tremble, allies respect her, and all subjects pledge loyalty solely to her. But despite her power and intellect, Queen Semiramis was equally famous for what happened behind palace doors. And no, not all of it had to do with architecture. Semiramis's private life became one of the most gossiped about topics of her reign. She had lovers, not one or two, but a carefully curated ensemble cast. Young, handsome, and sometimes politically influential. She didn't hide them. On the contrary, she rewarded them with land, titles, and pensions, if they behaved. If not, they were dismissed gently, sometimes with a polite thank you and a promotion. One of her most significant lovers was Menon, a bold, talented figure. Their relationship transcended romance, politics, and collaboration. Some historians believe they even secretly married. Together, they planned military campaigns, expanded colonies, and transformed Babylon's eastern frontier. Menon was not just a lover, he was a co-ruler. But neighboring kingdoms could not ignore the scandal. Rumors spread fast. Satirical stone carvings depicted Semiramis as a lust-driven, out-of-control figure. After her death, the gossip grew even more grotesque, the worst being a fabricated tale involving a horse, spread by her enemies to destroy her legacy. Why such obsession? Simple. Semiramis was a woman in power who apologized to no one. In a world where queens were expected to play either the holy virgin or the tragic victim, Semiramis refused to play by those rules. She lived, loved, and ruled on her own terms, and that made her dangerous. Ironically, though she was painted as immoral, Semiramis was deeply philosophical about love and sex. She believed pleasure was a natural part of life, and that private relationships did not necessarily threaten public responsibility. She separated emotion from politics, something few male monarchs managed to do. In fact, her relationships were often strategic. She surrounded herself with loyal, talented, and politically useful men. When their value faded, she let them go, often with a smile and a generous retirement package. Semiramis's love life didn't weaken her power. It was part of her strategy, a blend of passion and control that made her unforgettable, envied, and feared. But even with charm and mastery, Semiramis's reign was not without peril. And that year, the threat bore the name of a barbarian hero called Ninus II. He was no ordinary rebel. Ninus II claimed to be the resurrected king of Babylon, Semiramis's dead husband. According to him, he had survived the coup and now returned to reclaim the throne from the foreign usurper. Sounded absurd. Ninus had been dead for years, but to the downtrodden and desperate lower classes of Babylon, truth wasn't necessary, only hope. Ninus II promised liberation, the abolition of slavery, reduced tribute, and land redistribution. These promises ignited rebellion across Babylon's outskirts, especially among farmers and oppressed tribes. As the gap between nobility and commoners grew more brutal, those promises sounded like salvation. Ninus II's uprising became the largest rebellion in Babylonian history. Many towns fell, fortresses were captured, nobles were slaughtered. At one point, it seemed the entire empire might collapse. Semiramis was genuinely shaken. This wasn't a foreign war she could win with cavalry and treaties. This was an uprising from her own people, rising against the very system she ruled. But Semiramis didn't panic. She acted. She deployed professional military forces to ruthlessly crush the rebellion. Ninus II's army was defeated. He was captured, displayed in an iron cage, and ultimately executed publicly in Babylon, a warning to anyone who dared to follow. Afterward, Semiramis tightened order and control. Dreams of abolishing slavery quietly faded. The uprising had revealed to her the limits of idealistic vision in a nation still shackled by a harsh regime. She now leaned more heavily on the aristocracy, those willing to pledge loyalty in exchange for total control over commoners. This was a turning point. The queen who once championed great architects now prioritized stability over philosophy. Reforms became cautious. Surveillance increased. Rebellion, even as a whisper, would be crushed before it could breathe. Ninus II may have lost his head, but he left behind a chilling message that haunted Semiramis. Power built on inequality can only last until the storm arrives. By the time she entered the final years of her life, Semiramis had ruled Babylon for over 3 decades, longer than any queen in recorded history. From the moment she seized power, she shattered expectations, reshaped the empire, and redefined what a woman and a monarch could be. Under her reign, Babylon became a true superpower. Its territory expanded dramatically, swallowing wealthy regions, strategic cities, and coastal strips. These weren't just military victories. They were strategic turning points that secured trade routes and reshaped the ancient map. But her legacy didn't only appear on maps. Semiramis left a deep cultural imprint. She helped establish magnificent gardens, amassed one of the greatest collections of ancient texts, and maintained correspondence with major thinkers. Her court became a hub of refinement, art, and intellectual aspiration. In a world often dismissed as backward by other empires, Semiramis put Babylon on the cultural map. She modernized education, founded schools for women, and promoted book copying. She introduced advanced construction techniques into Babylon, even personally supervising building projects, a bold technical feat for her era. Still, her reign was full of contradictions. Though she admired progressive ideals, she never freed the slaves. In fact, she expanded slavery deeper into Babylon's newly acquired territories. Her reforms, while impressive, were largely top-down, designed more to polish the empire's image than to truly reshape its foundations. Nonetheless, Semiramis brought stability and ambition. She understood that power was not divine. It had to be built, managed, and constantly defended. She ruled not by mandate of heaven, but by will, political strategy, and relentless calculation. People called her many things: schemer, tyrant, reformer, seductress, but above all, she was effective. By the time she died, Babylon was wealthier, larger, and more formidable than it had been in centuries. She left behind a secure throne, a vast empire, and a legend that would echo for centuries. Semiramis did not merely reign. She governed with intelligence, strategy, and an unapologetic grip on history. And in doing so, she became more than a queen. She became a legend. Despite her power, territorial expansion, and enduring legacy, At her core, Semiramis was still a woman navigating a man's world and reshaping it in her own image. Behind royal portraits and state decrees was a woman deeply aware of the fragility of her position. She wasn't born Babylonian. She rose through a power struggle. She ruled an empire that never wanted a woman at the top. And yet, she didn't just survive, she triumphed. Semiramis never accepted being ornamental. She read endlessly, wrote tirelessly, and never stopped learning. Her daily schedule was intense. Hours spent reading reports, corresponding with foreign powers, editing state documents, and managing a court filled with factions. She didn't just sit on the throne. She ran it like a stateswoman born for the task. Still, in many ways, Semiramis was lonely. Though surrounded by courtiers, lovers, and artists, she once wrote in her memoirs that there were very few people she could truly trust. Her son, whom she distrusted and kept at arm's length from state affairs, grew into a man she feared would undo everything she had built. Her deepest emotional bond with Menon had gradually become a friendship, but his death left a wound that never truly healed. Semiramis carefully crafted her image. She understood the power of narrative and wielded it better than most rulers of her time. She presented herself as the mother of Babylon, a builder queen, a warrior, a patron of the arts. But behind those roles was a woman who endured rejection, betrayal, scandal, and rebellion, and kept moving forward. When she died, she left behind a transformed empire, but also questions. Could she have done more to end oppression? Would her grand monuments be overshadowed by politics? Was she a builder or a ruler? History remembers her with a title she never claimed for herself, the Great, not because she was perfect or kind or just, but because she seized power and used it on her own terms in a time and place where women were not allowed to have power at all. She didn't just wear the crown. She redefined what it meant to deserve it. In the damp depths of the ruined mounds at Ur, in southern Mesopotamia, the remains of the royal cemetery whisper stories from the ancient Sumerian world. Towering tombs lie hidden beneath dust and sand, their mud brick layers worn by time, yet still brimming with secrets. And in 1922, one of those secrets was revealed. A team of British archaeologists led by Leonard Woolley was surveying PG 800, a relatively modest burial pit beside grander royal tombs. PG 800 wasn't expected to hold much, until they noticed something unusual. A hidden chamber beneath the structure, untouched by grave robbers. It was intact. When the archaeologists broke through and lowered themselves inside, they found a wooden coffin lying silently. The air was heavy with the weight of millennia. As they opened the lid, golden dust rose like smoke, brilliant and shocking. The interior was filled with gemstone beads, a kind of sacred gold and precious stones used by the Sumerians in rituals. And in that golden cloud lay the skeleton of a woman. She had been buried with care and reverence. Her bones were delicate but intact, her skull still adorned with a golden leaf crown, and her body surrounded by offerings, necklaces, earrings, all crafted from gold, silver, and lapis lazuli. Everything about the burial radiated royalty, yet no name was clearly inscribed. No symbol definitively identified her. This was one of the richest female tombs ever discovered in Mesopotamia, and yet it was a complete mystery. Why was she buried in golden dust? Who was she? A queen, a high priestess, or perhaps a supreme figure? Researchers called her Queen Pwabi, and the name stuck. But even with modern forensic science, her identity remains uncertain. We only know she lived around the 3rd millennium BCE, during the golden age of Ur. Unlike most Sumerian tombs, hers had been hidden, undisturbed, and intentionally isolated. Her burial was not just ceremonial, it was spiritual. This woman was not remembered in words. She was remembered through ritual, color, and the mystery she left behind. The most haunting feature of Queen Pwabi's tomb wasn't the gold jewelry or the silence of the sealed room. It was the gold and lapis lazuli. A thick layer of gems and metal covered everything. Coffin, walls, her bones, even the surrounding offerings, clung like glory to stone. To the Sumerians, this was no coincidence. Gold and lapis lazuli, intricately crafted, were among the most sacred and prized materials of the ancient world. Their radiant gold and deep blue were more than visually striking. They symbolized wealth, immortality, and the power to connect the human and divine realms. These colors were sacred, the color of the sun, the sky, and the life that emerges from the underworld. And they weren't merely symbolic, they were spiritual. Enveloping the dead in such precious materials was a ritual of transformation, preserving the body not for eternity, but for transition. In Sumerian belief, death was not an end. It was a journey, a passage into another layer of the cosmos. And so, Queen Pwabi, whoever she truly was being prepared not merely for burial, but for deification. But there was another layer of meaning. Wealth accompanied death. Her attendants, musicians, and soldiers were buried alongside her. The Sumerians may not have understood chemistry, but they sensed the power of such wealth. It was rare, potent, sacred. Bathing a corpse in it was a declaration. This person was no ordinary mortal. In UR, few were buried with such extreme opulence. Mighty kings, rulers of the city, were among them. Her body, like theirs, was surrounded by treasures. That detail alone sparked speculation. Was Queen Pwabi the wife of a king, the mother of one, or someone with divine status herself? Her skull had been placed beneath a golden headdress, another sacred symbol. Around her, tiny gold figurines, obsidian blades, and ritual items suggested ceremonies conducted during her life or in her honor after death. Every part of her burial told an unspoken story, a story of power hidden in secrecy, a woman prepared to cross into the underworld, not in silence, but in ceremony, bathed in the colors of wealth. Surrounding Queen Pwabi's gold-stained remains was a silent world, broken only by the glint of gold, lapis lazuli, and carnelian. These were not just ornaments, they were essentials. Modernized in interpretation, the tomb feels intimate, not overdone but intentional. No gold chariots, no excess, only items selected with spiritual weight. It was a map for the soul. Through these treasures, we glimpse how the Sumerians understood death, not as an ending, but as a transfer of power. Queen Pwabi was not buried to be forgotten. She was being prepared to ascend. Though her tomb was magnificent, Queen Pwabi left behind a haunting emptiness. No name, no decorative inscriptions on the coffin, no cuneiform on the walls to identify her. She was clearly a figure of power. But who was she? From the moment her tomb was unearthed, scholars have tried to connect the clues. The most compelling theory is that Queen Pwabi was the wife of King Mescalamdug, now known as a famed ruler of UR. Mescalamdug's wife was not merely a consort. She was born into nobility and married into UR's royal dynasty at a young age. She bore at least 3 sons, all of whom held high positions and played an important ceremonial role throughout her husband's reign. If anyone deserved such an honored burial, it was her. Supporting this theory is the location of her tomb, within the royal cemetery of UR, just steps from the elaborate resting places of UR's kings. Such proximity suggests an intentional arrangement. Husband and wife, co-rulers, even in death. There were also signs of sacrificial rituals. Only a few tombs in UR have been found with clear evidence of such rituals, those of kings and Queen Pwabi. It's hard to believe this is mere coincidence. But from here, the mystery only deepens. Archaeological analysis has been carried out on both the artifacts and the remains, hoping to confirm a direct link. But the results are inconclusive. Evidence of a direct blood relationship between her and other known kings remains murky. However, this does not rule out the possibility that she was either his wife or an independent figure of power. Some suggest she may have been a high priestess wielding both religious and political authority, or a sister, or a royal ancestor whose name has been erased by time. Still, the evidence most clearly points to a queen of immense influence, mother of kings, and spiritual partner to UR's rulers. The absence of a name may not have been an oversight, but a deliberate choice. In the Sumerian worldview, souls did not live on through monuments, but through rituals, symbols, and the whispers of Mother Earth. And so, Queen Pwabi remains suspended between myth and reality. a woman who once ruled, not remembered in stone, but in dazzling treasures and the silence of her tomb. To understand Queen Pwabi, we must understand the world she lived in, a world where Sumerian women, especially royalty, held far more influence than many realize. In the civilization of ancient Mesopotamia, politics was often a family affair. Royal women were not passive consorts. They were diplomats, priestesses, and true wielders of power. They conducted rituals, sponsored temple construction, and played key roles in upholding dynastic legitimacy. Their bloodlines were political capital, used to forge alliances and secure succession. Take Queen Shagshag, for example, the mother of King Shulgi. When the throne was vacant, she seized power herself and ruled as regent until her son came of age. She was not merely a placeholder. She was a true ruler, issuing decrees and overseeing major construction projects. Without her, Shulgi might never have ascended, and she was not an exception. Across ancient Mesopotamia, in places like Mari, Lagash, and Kish, inscriptions reveal women who performed grand rituals, engaged in diplomatic warfare, and sometimes ruled in their own right. They are often depicted on steels and wall paintings, clad in elaborate ceremonial dress, crowned in bright diadems, standing beside kings as equals, or even, at times, taller. They were often depicted taller. Their words were inscribed in cuneiform, their names remembered until they no longer were. Queen Pwabi was not merely buried with treasure. She was interred in an intentionally designed structure, rich in Sumerian cosmology, ritual symbolism, and deliberate architectural intent. Her tomb was not just a tomb, it was a gateway to eternity. Her body was discovered within the royal cemetery of Uar, at the very heart of the ancient city. Yet, its particular location within the royal necropolis is especially striking. These temples were not built at random. Their positions were sacred, guided by astrology, mythology, and dynastic heritage. Tomb 3 rose modestly compared to its grand neighbor, but it concealed something deeper, a sealed crypt, never plundered, perfectly preserved. It was built deep into the temple's core, accessible only through a steep, narrow staircase. Descending into her crypt is almost symbolic, a ritual descent into the underworld. The inner chamber is stark, built of finely cut stone, sealed tight for over 4,500 years. There were no cuneiform texts or murals on the walls, no intricate carvings to tell her story, but perhaps that silence was intentional. This was not a space for the living to interpret, but for the dead to transform. At its center, her stone sarcophagus stood like an altar, echoing the grand stone coffins of the kings of Uar beside it. While other tombs are famous for carvings depicting cosmic rebirth, Queen Pwabi's resting place is quieter. The focus is the body, the grave goods, and the ritual of death itself. Yet even so, there are subtle architectural cues of meaning. The tomb was aligned on an east-west axis, symbolizing the journey of the sun from life to death. The small chamber but powerful. It gives a sense of intention, intimacy, a sacred place reserved for someone revered. Sumerian temples were cosmic tools, bridges linking heaven, earth, and the underworld. To be buried within a temple meant to be lifted above the mortal realm. Queen Pwabi's final resting place was not an afterthought. It was a carefully constructed sanctuary where death became transformation. Her bones lay in stone, her essence in pure gold artifacts, and her legacy etched into the architecture itself. A temple that needed no inscription to declare that she once existed and mattered. For the ancient Sumerians, death was not an end. It was a threshold, a sacred passage into the underworld known as Kur. And for someone like Queen Pwabi, that passage was not merely spiritual. It was political, cosmological, and deeply ritualized. The funerary rites were carefully choreographed events, steeped in mythology, meant to guide the soul through the perilous layers of the underworld. Sumerian texts and symbols reveal that Kur was not a peaceful afterlife. It was a maze of darkness, endless rivers, trials, and death gods. Only those properly buried, ritually prepared, and spiritually strong could successfully make the journey. Queen Pwabi was buried wrapped in precious fabrics, laid in a stone coffin, and surrounded by lavish offerings. All signs of an elite burial. But there was more. The presence of attendants and guards sacrificed within her tomb suggests rituals of self-sacrifice, possibly symbolic reenactments of rites she performed in life, or rituals enacted at her burial to empower her soul. Her gold crown and intricately crafted gemstone jewelry were not merely ornaments. They likely served as symbols of power and identity, preserving her visage and status as she entered the afterlife. In Sumerian belief, the face was the mirror of the soul, and the soul needed to be recognized by the gods. The pottery and metal vessels around her may have once held water, food, or even beer to sustain her in the next world. Other items, like golden lyres, weapons, and personal effects, may have represented spiritual tools, calls to the gods, or signals for ceremonial communication. Burial was not just a farewell, it was transformation. The Sumerians believed in cycles. Death was a seed, burial is an act of sowing, and the afterlife is rebirth. Kings and queens were often regarded as embodiments of gods on earth, and in death they returned to that divine origin. Queen Pwabi, clad in pure gold, entombed within the royal necropolis and honored with lavish offerings, was being prepared not merely to rest, but to be reborn, not as a mortal, but as a being woven into the sacred order of the cosmos. Her burial was not the end of a story, it was the beginning of a legend. Just steps away from Queen Pwabi's final resting place lies one of the most iconic tombs in Mesopotamia, the burial site of King Mesgalamdug, often remembered simply as the mighty king of Ur. His interment in the royal cemetery of Ur is renowned for its artistry, grandeur, and profound spiritual symbolism. But what makes Queen Pwabi's tomb extraordinary is not only what lies within, but where it was found. Her coffin was hidden within a temple next to the kings of Ur, right beside the monument of Mesgalamdug. In a city like Ur, where every temple was meticulously placed to reflect cosmic principles, such proximity was no accident. It was intentional, a declaration carved in stone. Many scholars believe that Queen Pwabi was indeed the royal consort and trusted companion of King Mesgalamdug. Though her tomb bears no inscribed name, the similarities between the two burials are striking. Both were interred with immense quantities of gold and gemstones, housed in significant architectural structures, and treated with the highest reverence. The rituals mirror one another, like two halves of a sacred story. Mesgalamdug's tomb is famed for its wealth and ritual evidence, a cosmic setting for death and rebirth. Sarah Biffen was born on October 25, 1784, in a rural part of Devonshire, then a quiet village nestled in the English countryside. Her childhood home, a small cottage, was filled with challenges, contradictions, and a quiet strength. It would later become the starting point for the extraordinary journey of one of the most iconic artists of the Victorian era. Sarah was the youngest in a large farming family. Her parents, though loving, faced a harsh reality. Sarah was born without arms or legs. Her parents embodied two opposite approaches to adversity, one of resignation, the other of resourceful determination. Sarah inherited introspection and extraordinary willpower from her condition, but also a fierce resilience from her earliest days. From a young age, Sarah was imaginative, outspoken, and brave. She hungered for knowledge and asked questions most adults avoided. Her physical condition could not be hidden, but she never allowed it to limit her spirit. Her circumstances made her dependent on others, but within that quiet, she began to find a path. Her parents encouraged her to be self-reliant, and she soon learned how to use her mouth and shoulders to carry out daily tasks. Unlike most girls of her time, Sarah did not dream of becoming a wife or a homemaker in the traditional sense. Her dream was to find purpose, and at the age of 13, she enrolled in an art program in London, one of the few disabled individuals accepted despite skepticism. There, Sarah stood out not only for her talent, but for her extraordinary persistence, progressive thinking, and unique adaptability. She participated in public exhibitions, where she demonstrated her ability to paint using only her mouth and shoulders. Sarah was drawn to art, to paths that defied convention. Even in those early years, before fame would define her legacy, and before aristocrats would endorse her, Sarah Biffen was sketching herself into the world with bold strokes, unapologetic ideas, and a selfhood too expansive to be confined by anyone's expectations. She wasn't just coming of age in the countryside. She was preparing to reinvent herself. Around 1797, Sarah Biffen's life split in two: the girl she had been and the woman she was forced to become. That afternoon, she was hired by a fairground organizer named Emmanuel Dukes. He promised her a new life but also brought constraints. Sarah never did anything halfway, but just moments after stepping into the world of entertainment, her future cracked into exploitation, doubt, and silence. The fair circuit was grueling. She was displayed as a curiosity. Her uniqueness turned into spectacle. Sarah was confined to the role of a marvel, pierced her dignity and shattered her dreams. Her freedom was fractured, her will splintered, her spirit misaligned, her recognition broken, her role displaced. She was only a teenager. A man cloaked her in pity. Another man, however, saw her talent shimmer, not for its oddity, but for the brush and pigment she used, which cloaked her extraordinary form in a glittering dust of artistry. Sarah was taken to towns and subjected to many performances in the months that followed. She lay for weeks in circus tents, immobile, aching with doubt and uncertainty. The future she once dreamed of, becoming a free artist, seemed to drift further away with each passing day. Yet within that silence, something began to rise. Mr. Dukes gave her brushes. A special easel was crafted so she could paint. A mirror was placed before her so she could see herself. And there, in confinement and pain, Sarah began to paint. At first for survival, then from obsession. Her first subject was her own reflection, for it was all she had. But what emerged wasn't vanity. It was survival. Her condition limited her body but opened a door inward, to extraordinary ability, and ultimately to a surreal language of determination and identity that would define her art. The girl once seen as helpless now asserted herself, brushstroke by brushstroke. As Sarah Biffen lay surrounded by curious stares and spectacle, a body resisting itself with every breath, she began to paint. What had been livelihood became language, and that language was deeply personal, brutally honest, and often hard to look at. That was the point. Sarah did not paint mere landscapes or commissioned portraits. She painted survival, her survival, bodily, emotional, and existential. Her first subject was a self-portrait, not out of vanity, but as she famously said, "I paint myself because I am often alone and because I know myself best." Her early works were small in scale, painted on tiles or wood, inspired by the miniature portraits of the era, artworks that told stories of people and fate. Sarah internalized that tradition. Her body became the canvas, her resilience the altar. She painted herself facing adversity, rising. In one portrait, she depicted herself as a modern warrior, brush in mouth. In another, she floated within a challenging world, bound by prejudice and physical constraints, a metaphor for the hands she was born without. She painted herself painting, restricted, doubted, underestimated, but never passive, always observing. Her resilience was never diminished. She painted life's harshness with beauty, defiance, and even grace. Each painting was a reclamation of her body, her experience, and her identity as a woman without arms in a world that tried to define her. But Sarah didn't just tell her story. She was inventing an entirely new visual language, a style that blended the precision of miniatures, technical brilliance, and the transcendence of physical limits. Her paintings became living dreams, framed by talent, resolve, and indomitable will. By the time she succeeded enough to define herself, despite many prejudices, Sarah was no longer the girl once pitted. She was an artist, and her art unlike anything the world had seen. She turned the worst thing that had ever happened to her into the deepest source of creativity. Sarah Biffen didn't just force the world to look at her life, and in doing so, she transformed endurance into a sacred act of self-expression. In 1824, still devoted to her art and at the age of 40, Sarah Biffen met the man who would become the most profound and tumultuous relationship of her life, William Stephen Wright. Described as a gentleman who had served in the Navy, Wright had been involved with Biffen for some time before they married. With his massive frame and dominating presence, Wright was a giant of the aristocratic world, known for his elegance and naval background. Sarah had encountered many men like him before. She admired them, but now she wanted stability. They married on September 6, 1824, at Kilton Church in Somerset. Their marriage didn't last. Soon after the wedding, Wright left Biffen. Some sources suggest he exploited her financially, though Biffen denied this, stating that at the time of their marriage, she had little wealth and that Wright supported her with an annual stipend of £40 when he could. Following the failed marriage, Biffen continued her artistic career, known for a time as Mrs. E.M. Wright. She overcame many challenges and remained dedicated to her art until her final days. She never stopped painting, with a brush fastened to her shoulder or held in her mouth, creating masterpieces like Self-Portrait at the Easel circa 1821, which sold at Sotheby's for £137,500, far exceeding its original estimate. She also painted notable figures such as Queen Victoria, 1848, and Ada Lovelace, 1842. The pioneering mathematician and first computer programmer, proudly signing her works by Sarah Biffen without hands. She continued creating miniature portraits of gentlemen and ladies, along with still lives and studies like A Study of Feathers. No matter how much upheaval and heartbreak life brought, her passion for art remained an irreplaceable force. He challenged her, he hurt her, but she still believed in herself as an artist, as a woman who could redefine the meaning of painting. She was not at peace, but she was a legend. In the years following her broken marriage, Sarah Biffen continued her artistic journey, directly confronting social prejudice, wealth, and the contradictions of the Victorian era, which left her with a deep unease about her place in the world. Sarah was a steadfast artist, a strong woman, and a lover of artistic tradition. The opulence she witnessed from her upper-class patrons, especially while she faced personal struggles, only fueled her determination to assert herself. In letters and writings, she mocked the culture of superficiality and obsession with status. She remembered the dust, the authenticity, and the struggles of her life. While many conformed to societal rules, Sarah began to paint quieter, more personal revolutions in her portraits and still lives. Her style became more distinct, sharp, unique, deeply emotional, and intensely personal. It was during these periods of confrontation with prejudice and doubt that Sarah Biffen created small portraits with immense weight. She didn't paint to provoke curiosity. She painted to affirm her existence. Her armless, legless body wasn't a limitation. It was the frame of her willpower. With only her mouth and a brush clenched in her teeth, she created her world, stroke by deliberate stroke. Her miniature portraits, painted on ivory or small tins, weren't just technically impressive. They were a desperate yearning to be recognized as alive. She painted herself without arms, without legs, but her gaze never looked away. Always calm, always direct, without apology. One of her most moving works, Self-Portrait at the Easel, shows her sitting in a modest setting, brush propped from her shoulder, proud and defiant. No words, just a look that declares, "I am here, and I am an artist." That canvas held a manifesto. Returning to Somerset after years traveling with the fair, Sarah Biffen entered the world of high art, where even able-bodied artists struggled to make their mark. She didn't hide her disability. She signed her work with "painted by mouth, no hands." It wasn't an excuse. It was a proclamation. She didn't just paint. She redefined resilience through art. While Victorian gentlemen painted portraits to flatter the elite, Biffen painted to reclaim space for the forgotten. Every stroke was a silent but sharp rebuttal. Every brushstroke, a step beyond pity. In her small studio where she lived and painted, there was nothing ostentatious. Only precision, silence, and an undying fire. She didn't wait to be recognized. She carved her name into history. When the Victorian court awarded her medals, when nobles commissioned her portraits, it wasn't pity, it was reverence. Sarah Biffen wasn't just a mouth-painting artist. She was a gravitational force, where skill, discipline, and dignity fused into legend. In her final years, as her health waned, the brush remained clenched between her teeth, inseparable from her being. Though abandoned by her husband, though misunderstood, she kept painting, not to please anyone, but to remind the world that beauty doesn't lie in form, but in the endurance of the spirit. Biffen didn't ask for sympathy. She inspired. She didn't live to prove that disabled people could make art, but that people with inner strength will always create art. There were times when Sarah lay motionless for weeks in a custom wooden chair, her head strapped in place, her armless, legless body curled within heavy Victorian garments. But she kept painting. Each artwork from those years was both a form of release and a quiet act of defiance. Her work grew deeper, bolder. She painted with a sharpness forged from prejudice, from skepticism, from being seen as a curiosity rather than an artist. She didn't hide behind symbolism. She was the symbol. In Self-Portrait at the Easel, Sarah presents herself as a living declaration. No arms, no legs, brush clamped between her teeth, easel standing solemn like an altar, her eyes serene, her gaze unflinching. For Sarah, pain was no longer a wound. It was an ally, an adversary, a creative spark. And when society said she should be a spectacle, she turned each portrait into an indictment of pity. She didn't shout slogans in the streets, but every time she signed Sarah Biffen, painted by mouth, it was a political statement. In an era when women weren't allowed to exhibit independently, and disabled people were treated as charity cases, she forced her way into the art world with mastery and unshakable pride. When lavishly dressed ladies commissioned her portraits, Sarah didn't just capture their faces. She compelled them to confront her, the armless woman redefining beauty through her very being. In 1821, Sarah exhibited her work at the Royal Academy, a rare honor for any artist and even rarer for a disabled woman. But she didn't arrive meekly. She appeared as a lady, dressed in embroidered silk, wearing a tall hat, brush in her mouth, signing her name before the public. In that space, amid curiosity and admiration, she stood unafraid. Every painting was a manifesto, every stroke a silent rebuttal to doubt. Her late works, though tiny, sometimes just a few centimeters, contained whole universes of detail, shadow, light, and dignity. In Portrait of a Lady in a White Lace Dress, she painted each fold, each strand of hair as if she were embroidering with her gaze. But truly, she was stitching her resilience into the canvas. And as a final flourish, she signed not with hands, but with willpower. On October 2nd, 1850, Sarah Biffen died in Liverpool, alone, without descendants, without posthumous fame. Her death certificate read, "Artist," but those close to her whispered that she had fought not just biological fate, but a societal structure that crushed opportunities for disabled women. Before she passed, she still painted. Though her lips were weary, her teeth aching, the brush still gently touched the page. Her funeral was quiet, with no flags, no hymns. But in the decades that followed, something extraordinary happened. Sarah Biffen refused to disappear. At first, her name was a mere footnote at auctions. Then feminist historians, art critics, and the disability rights movement brought her back into the light. Her work defied labeling, too refined to be called merely a marvel, too sophisticated to be dismissed as an anomaly. Sarah was no longer just the armless woman who painted portraits. She was a symbol of resilience, of intellect surpassing physical limitations, of art born from fierce determination. A woman who refused to be silent, refused to retreat, and signed her name into history with a brush, with her mouth, with immeasurable resolve. Her face, no arms, no legs, brush held between her lips, gaze quiet yet proud, became iconic. Her miniature portraits became museum treasures. Her painted-by-mouth signature became a defiant last word. And her life, once seen as odd, now reads like an epic. Sarah Biffen had been confined by prejudice, circus tents, and pity. But in death, she stepped into the light. She left behind more than paintings. She left a mirror and dared us to look, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with respect. Today, Sarah Biffin's name is no longer buried in fine print. Her paintings are exhibited, written about, restored, discussed in art programs, podcasts, and galleries. The image of the armless woman, leaning in to paint with her mouth beside an easel, has become recognizable and unforgettable. But what makes her legacy powerful isn't that people recognize her appearance, but that they see the force behind it. Sarah never tried to hide her disability. She didn't perform a miracle. She didn't conform to Victorian ideals, nor did she seek acceptance. In a society that demanded docility, she gave us truth. Raw, determined, silent yet resounding. She honored what excluded her. Her incomplete body, her status as a woman, her relentless ambition, and turned them into timeless art. She wasn't just a mouth-painting artist. She was a global icon of perseverance, of quiet but unyielding feminism, of creativity unchained by the body. To disabled individuals, she proved that art doesn't require hands, only will. To 19th century women, she reminded them that value lies not in marriage, but in courage. And to British art history, she was a forgotten chapter, now being rewritten with admiration. Her paintings, once viewed as performances, are now praised as technical and spiritual masterpieces. Each meticulous portrait, each strand of hair, each layer of lace, not just to be seen, but felt. Because anyone who's ever been considered different understands. To exist through art, in a world that denies your place, is victory. Sarah once lived at the margins and turned the margins into the center. She embraced paradox. A woman without hands holding a brush, an artist once rejected, now celebrated. A fragile body with iron resolve. And through it all, she painted, not just with a brush, but with spirit. Sarah Biffin never asked to be a symbol. She simply told the truth about herself. And in doing so, she told the truth for millions who had been silenced. Now, when we see her name, we see hope. We see courage. We see resilience. We see Sarah not vanished but immortal,